Yes, welcome in. Getting to that time of the year where there's not a ton to talk about, but Jesse's always producing content that we can then rip and put in this show, right?
That's the goal.
Yeah, that's exactly the goal, and that's exactly what we're going to do today, a little bit. Obviously, you did your too deep for the defense. We're going to jump into that, and then we're also going to do something that I've been, I guess, not trying to do, but thinking about doing for a month, but there's just always been something to talk about that we didn't need it. But it's one of those things that we can throw in here where there's not a ton going on. There hasn't been really any developments in the Xavier Lucas situation. There's been very little on the recruiting front, as several guys that they were going after transfer portal wise have ended up elsewhere. So we're going to dive into ranking the Luke Fickell era 2 years in, or I guess I'd say 2 years and a couple of months in. Very, very unfair to do, but we're going to do it anyways because that's what media is. We are sometimes, me more so than Jesse, unfair. So we're gonna do that. But and then
totally fair. It's totally fair, by the way. I don't have
to
any
judge him already.
I don't have any qualms with this. You can give a grade 2+ years in when you've coached 25 games and understand that there are more games to be had where you can provide a future grade. But that's in a big enough sample size for us to say, here's what we've seen.
Okay. All right. Well, then I feel good about it. I was feeling a little off about it. Wasn't really sure. I appreciate you. So we're going to dive into all that. Before we do, Home Field Apparel, the official apparel sponsor of the camp. They have unmatched vintage gear in the college game. Go check them out, homefieldapparel.com, and use the promo code Bucky24 for 15% off your first purchase. All right, let's jump into this. The defense and special teams too deep that you put out on The Athletic. We both, I think we agreed when you were about to do this that it was going to be more difficult than the offensive too deep because there were so many new faces on that side of the ball. And when we talked about the offense, it was, gosh, the wide receiver spot's probably, really, really difficult to do. For the defensive side of the ball, what was the most difficult one to try and come up with?
Defensive line, in my mind, without question. Part of this is, what is the structure of the defense going to look like? Is it just going to be the same thing? I suppose you could say I sort of cheated because there's 12 starters, but I wanted to have 3 defensive linemen and there's 5 defensive backs. So go ahead.
Do you think if they have 12 on the field, they could stop the run better?
I would like to think so.
All right. So maybe they'll petition for that.
But I also think there's going to be a lot more situations, presumably, where you see 3 defensive linemen on the field. At least I would think, if you're going to go and get all these defensive linemen. So that's the first part. But the reason it's so challenging is because there's only 3 guys that return that were on the roster a year ago: Dylan Johnson, Brandon Lane, and Ben Barton. And they bring in 5 transfer portal players. And sometimes it's really easy to know, you plug this dude in, he's a starter. For example, Tanner Koziel at tight end. I think he's going to get a lot of opportunities considering he had 94 catches at Ball State. On the D line, it's so tough to know. And I ended up going with 3 guys as my starters who weren't here a year ago. So we'll know much more, obviously, when spring practice commences. But I've got JVR Suggs, Parker Peterson, and then Corey Walker. Again, I don't know how all of them are specifically going to be utilized, but I know that Peterson, because I talked to Peterson and Walker, Peterson said it was brought in to be a run stuffer up the middle. That's what he did when he was at Tulane. He was head up over the center, and Corey Walker is more of a defensive end. I just think Suggs, if he is what we think he can be, is going to find his way into the rotation. I dropped Ben Barton down. Now, he started every game on the D-line a year ago. He's certainly going to be in the mix to be a starter. I'm not going to overlook that. He's got a ton of experience, but he's one of the backups. They should be able to rotate 5 and 6 defensive linemen, which is what Luke Fickell has wanted from the outset. But no question, to me, D-line was the toughest to try and project just because there's so many new faces and you don't know how these pieces to the puzzle are going to come together.
Right, because you haven't seen them in practice yet, exactly what the coaches think about them, right? Like you can say that they had this type of production here and this is the type of the production they had there, but until you actually see it in practice and exactly what it's all going to look like. And I do wonder if they're still probably trying to figure all that stuff out too, right? This is probably not something that is locked, or I should say written in ink and can't be erased and changed. I think a lot of this is probably pencil based with the defensive line, because I do think a lot of those guys are going to play a lot of snaps. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I feel like the more snaps you can get out of, like, if you can have a significant rotation, that's a good thing. Now, you would like to have guys step up and be the guys, like when you need a stop or you need like there's a really good team and they're running the ball and they're having success, that you can put guys in there and you know they're going to have success. That's certainly what you would prefer. But the fact that you have a bunch of different guys you can rotate through there, I think is important. Now, they had a lot of guys last year too, and it didn't necessarily result in anything, but they've remade that room. And while we can sit here and say, oh, I don't know what it's going to look like, you can't say they didn't try. And you can't say that they didn't make an effort to revamp what that room looked like after what was I don't want to use hyperbole here, but a disastrous year trying to stop the run. And certainly the defensive line plays a big role in that.
Yeah, we mentioned the stats previously. If you're last in the country in tackles for loss, that's not all on the defensive line, but you do have a responsibility up front to help out your linebackers and maybe make an occasional play. So they know they need to be better. And if I'm just trying to project what the two deep could look like, I mentioned Ben Barton. Dillon Johnson's certainly going to be a factor. I don't want to rule him out as a potential starter, too. For him to even get reps as a true freshman speaks to what they think about him. And certainly some of that had to do with where they were at on the defensive line. I'm really intrigued by Charles Perkins, too. He's from UT Martin. Really, again, tough to project when you move up a level, but he was an FCS freshman All-American a couple of years ago, and I think he can give them something. Is Brandon Lane ready to take a step up? Now, they've got 3 true freshmen that are coming in. That's always a challenge for somebody that young to crack the rotation, especially now when you've added 5 guys who have played. But they know they have to be better, and you're right, Zach. If nothing else, you could say they tried. They did everything they could to upgrade, and we'll see in year 3 whether it makes a difference.
Yeah. So you talked about tackles for loss, and the other spot on the field, or I should say the other position on the field that was certainly lacking in that respect, was outside linebacker, where they weren't difference makers this past year. And they went and added a couple of guys there, at least in the transfer portal, and then have Daryl Peterson back and Aaron Witt back. Sebastian Cheeks, I think, could play a role, and then Thomas Heiberger. And then you have a bunch of younger guys that are going to be interested to see exactly where they're at in their development.
I went with Daryl Peterson and Mason Reiger, the transfer from Louisville. Peterson, I know last year he didn't have the year that he wanted. We have touched on the fact that they used him in some different ways, put his hand down on the ground. Maybe that's not the best approach forward for him, given what you saw over the 12 games, but he still played 400 plus snaps a year ago and 500 plus snaps the previous year. He's a multi-year starter. I just don't see him suddenly dropping into a backup role unless someone else truly emerges on a consistent level. The Reiger one is interesting because he missed all of last year with an injury, but 2 years ago, he had 5 sacks. There's nobody on this roster a year ago who was here that had more than 3 sacks. Like that was the high. So if he can give you what he gave Louisville a couple years ago, I can see him ascending into that role. The other transfer that they brought in off the edge is Tyrese Fearbry from Kentucky, one of those guys who is coming from an SEC Power 4 program, but maybe didn't give you a ton of productivity in terms of tackles and everything else. I think he's certainly going to be a part of the rotation, you would think, but they've got a lot of other guys. Aaron Witt, as a 6th-year senior, I think he's going to he showed what he can do in a run stuffer. I mean, what did he have? 5.5 tackles for loss last year. So he was one of the guys that gave you something in that category. Sebastian Cheeks, they used him a lot in some of those 3rd down pass rushing situations. And the Heiberger one, to me, still one of the more intriguing guys in the room, because as we know, Matt Mitchell said this in the preseason when he got hurt out in Platteville, he was going to be a part of the rotation. And we saw flashes of that in practice dating to the spring. So I'm really intrigued by him, but they have a lot of options. And will any of the freshmen emerge? Like Jalen Williams, obviously, 6'6", athletic, crazy athletic, super long. That's the type of body that they've been missing in that room. And part of what Luke Fickell was talking about when he said that they wanted to be able to get bigger. So can somebody like that make a big jump as a young guy? It's certainly not impossible.
Yes. You mentioned what Mason Reiger did 2 years ago. That's the same thing that Daryl Peterson did, essentially, right? Like he had 4.5 sacks, double-digit number tackles for loss. Can you get that Daryl Peterson back is, I think, is the question. And I would hope that they would put him in a more advantageous spot to have success than his hand on the ground trying to rush against interior linemen. But we'll see exactly how they want this all to look. And he can, I think, be a playmaker if he's on the edge. I don't know about being a playmaker with his hand on the ground, even though he did that a ton in high school because he was like a defensive end in high school and had his hand on the ground in high school. But that's completely different than being asked to move inside and play the type of technique that he was being asked to do. And so we'll see. We'll see what happens if they move him back out to the actual outside of it and he gets to go against tackles and uses speed on the edge and all that good stuff. So moving to the inside linebacker spot, another area where they did add some guys, but it feels like you would expect that Christian Allegro and Tackett Curtis would be first up there, no?
That's who I'm going with. I think Allegro, I don't know if lost in the shuffle is the right way to put it, but because so many things went wrong defensively, we didn't necessarily talk very often about what went right. I think Allegro had a really good year. He had a 16 tackle game, which is the most that any player at Wisconsin has had since Leo Chanel had a 17 tackle game in 2021. Now, some of that may be because you're not stopping him in the backfield, but he had a very good season, and I would expect him certainly to be one of the starters. Tackett Curtis, if he can continue that ascension, and the farther he gets away from having the sports hernia injury and the surgery, I think the better that he will be. Now, they added one from the transfer portal, Antron Turner from Western Carolina, and so I think he's going to be certainly a part of this rotation too. Will Tyler Janze be able to become more of an impact playmaker? He's been in a room where they had a lot of veterans and it was tough to break through. It felt like he was on the cusp, but you can only play so many. So I think that would be my top group at this stage, but they've got some other options as well. And of course, the freshmen that they're bringing in, I mean, absolute home run with the two guys. Cooper Catalano, all-time tackles leader in the state of Wisconsin, and Mason Posa, who to me might be the most intriguing or exciting guy in this recruiting class just because, as we've talked about, you look at the film and you think that guy has a future right away at Wisconsin because he's just such a playmaker and fierce and a force.
Yeah, and obviously Landon Gauthier, the other redshirt freshman who came in early last year, is another guy that was a bit of a tackle machine in high school too, and you would expect maybe a jump for him as well. So yes, inside linebacker is an interesting one. I will absolutely give a lot of blame to the inability to set an edge to the outside linebackers, and ability to bottle up guys, allow at the line of scrimmage, the defensive line, and getting pushed down the field. But the inside linebackers too didn't make enough flash plays last year. But I think getting Christian back and the speed that he presents and the those 16 tackles, like how many, where exactly were they on the field? That's right. So, but I certainly do think that they can be better at that spot because Christian will take a jump. And you mentioned Tackett coming back and having a full offseason where he's not rehabbing an injury necessarily. He's just getting better he's getting better himself. And not because that takes so much out of you to have to rehab an injury like an entire offseason. That's essentially what he had to do. And it doesn't really let you get better. It's like you're trying to get back to what you were. And I think this offseason allows him a chance to get better. Cornerback, we kind of touched on this last week when we were talking about Ricardo Hallman coming back and being back for his senior year, but getting him back is just, I think, significant to your depth chart. Makes it a little bit easier.
Yeah, it's massive. Obviously, he started 33 games. He's played in 37, started every game the last two seasons. And like we mentioned on the last show, the numbers went down last year, but a lot of that had to do with teams not wanting to throw in his direction because what he did in 2023 when he had 7 interceptions. So he is the building block on the back end there, and that is huge. I think I'm sort of surprised that Wisconsin was not able to add more from the transfer portal at cornerback. Now, that doesn't mean that it's not going to happen. We know there's a spring window because they added 2 corners, but they also lost a ton of dudes to the portal. So the 2 that they added certainly going to be a part of the mix here. Hallman is very clearly a starter. I think Deone Hill, the guy from Miami, probably fills the other starting spot, but Jameer Latimer is somebody who played a ton at Jacksonville State, more snaps than anybody else in that cornerback room. So it's going to be one of those guys in my mind because you went and got portal guys that are veterans for a reason. Hill started 5 games at Miami. The intriguing thing here is what do they do in the slot? I'm looking at the roster and just thinking, It probably ends up being Austin Brown. At least that's what I think now. Certainly, he came in as a safety. He can play safety, but he played 200 plus snaps in the slot a year ago. Ended up occupying that role a lot more after the first few games when Max Lofi was handling that. So I think that somewhere in those four is probably the top three, but whoever's four is going to play a ton of snaps. And the backup slot, maybe it's Owen Arnett, because I just look at the guys that they brought in. Those are corners that have played on the outside. They played some in the slot, but that's not necessarily their forte. Now, maybe that changes when spring practice starts, but I think those are a lot of the guys that you're looking at right now to be a part of that rotation.
Yeah, I'm not going to disagree with any of that. That's I think that makes a ton of sense, and we'll see exactly. I mean, again, they have one proven slot right now in Austin Brown, and Owen Arnett has played it a ton in practice, like a ton in practice. We've seen it a ton in practice, but we haven't seen it a ton in the games. So I think that leaves the possibility that somebody else could be there, but I think he certainly is going to be in the mix, but we'll see. Safety is also another area where they were able to add guys in the portal, and intriguing guys that we've talked about, certainly Matt Young being one of them, but how do you see that playing out?
Well, we talk about Ricardo Hallman coming back. I think getting Preston Zachman back is a big deal. He started all 12 games for Wisconsin last season. He's played a ton. So you can lock up a starting spot there. I'm going to go with Matthew Traynor on the other side. He was his conference's freshman rookie of the year when he was at Richmond. So I think he's ready to make that leap. I know I've talked a couple times here about Matt Young just because I wrote about him and he has such an interesting story. Certainly he's going to have an opportunity to start, but at the very least, he's a part of this two deep. I don't think you go and bring in a portal guy if you don't think he's going to contribute, and you just look at the rest of the room. There's a lot of young players there. He's the best player in Division III, at 109 tackles last season at Bethel, had 9 interceptions and 4 pick sixes. So physically, is he ready to make the leap to the Big Ten? We'll have to find out. And then I talked about Owen Arnett and potentially a slot role, but you go down the list at safety, who's going to be part of the reserves. I think he's certainly in the mix there. Is Charlie Jarvis in there? That you just have so many young guys because you still have Raphael Dunn, and you're bringing in 4 guys in this 2025 recruiting class as safety. So there's a lot of opportunity for some of those young guys, but if given the choice before we see practice, I'm always going to pick veterans because you at least have a better idea of what they can provide.
And the number of safeties that they have leads me to think that one of them could end up being one of those slots. You know, you have Austin Brown there, obviously, but you have Owen Arnett as the backup. I think perhaps one of those guys may be able to play that role as well, because it feels like they have more safeties than they have corners at this point. But again, that slot position is one that can really not be interchangeable. Like last year, Max Lofi, he was a corner, had a little bit of safety, but he was a corner, and then obviously Austin Brown can do both. But it's the spot requires versatility, and I think that they have some versatility in that safety room to be able to potentially use one of them back there. All right, so that's the defense. Special teams wise, quickly.
Yeah, we'll go quick. Nathaniel Vacos still the starting kicker, even though his numbers this year were not great. 12 for 19, field goal attempts 6 for 12 on 30 to 49 yards. I've got Gavin Lom as the backup there. Atticus Bertram's pretty damn good season in year 2, so he's still a starting punter. I've got Stone Anderson as the backup. They brought him in as a transfer from Michigan. Gavin Lom should probably still be the kickoff specialist. On long snapper, they brought in a portal guy for the second straight offseason, Eli Stein, who's a Wisconsin native, who was at Arkansas. He left the team before the start of last season because he was going to have a reduced role. And then the punt return and kick return, which are always intriguing. I put Tretch Kekahuna as the number 1 punt returner, largely because if you're going to bring him back and he can be this dynamic playmaker, then let him do his thing, because Hunter Wohler's gone. Vinny Anthony certainly can do it. I think he's the starting kick returner, certainly based on what he did, and he's going to play a ton of snaps at wide receiver. I'm putting Tyrell Henry as the backup punt returner. He did muff a punt against USC that was a turnover and led to a touchdown for the Trojans. And then I'll go Cade Yakameli as my backup kick returner. He's still here. He can do some things. He returned a few kicks a year ago. So that's the short rundown on the special teams side of things, but certainly going to have some options in the return game, I would think.
Definitely. Gosh, bringing up bad memories with that the Tyrell Henry mentioned, but he also barely
he
played.
returned 3 punts. So, if you got a small sample size and one of them was a muff that you gave away, it's worth mentioning.
Yes, but it also brings back memories of like how many times they put the ball on the ground to start the season. Like the first 6 or 7 games, it was like every single game there was a punt on the ground, either from them or the other team, right? So because the other team did a whole bunch of it as well. I don't know that they win. Which game was that?
Well, Western Michigan in the opener, certainly.
Was it? I feel like right. But I'm trying to think if they win that game. Like it was either the Western Michigan game or the South Dakota game. I think it was the Western Michigan game. Like if the Western Michigan guy doesn't fumble it, I don't know exactly what happens there.
No, Wisconsin was down 14-13, 45 seconds into the fourth quarter. So, well, we talked about Atticus Bertram's has a force field that's magical around the football very clearly. So I want whatever he's been able to conjure up.
All right. So we have thought about this for a while, or I should say I thought about this for a while, and just doing this as kind of an off-season project. We will also obviously grade the press boxes here at some point, but this was going to be today's, and that is grading the Luke Fickell era. We are, what'd you say, 25 games in here? He is 12-13 in those games, but it's not just about on-field performance that we're going to grade. We got 7 categories and then an overall grade. And I will start here with the first one. And then I told when I told you about these categories, I said you can however you want to, identify them or however you want to do this. You're more than welcome to. But in-game coaching, what would you give Luke Fickell in-game coaching wise to this point? Excuse me, the Luke Fickell program, the Luke Fickell era. It's not just Luke Fickell. It's the entire program. So in-game coaching, which has a lot to do with Luke Fickell.
I'm going to be a harsh grader here, which maybe goes against what people think of me. I'm not really sure, but we've also had to watch all of these games and understand what the standard at Wisconsin was for a long time. So when you're under 500 since the start of last season, there's not going to be a lot of A's and B's. I'm going to give it a D. I am. And I totally understand that I'm not in the rooms every day and they work their asses off to do the best that they can, probably sleeping in the office, but I've got to go on what I see. And when you're under 500 and you had a defense that gave up 40 points in a game 3 times last year for the first time since 2001, and you've fired your offensive line coach, you've fired your offensive coordinator, and you've just had a lot of disastrous performances, more bad losses than good wins, it's hard for me to give you even a passing grade. That doesn't mean it can't change. But I think of, maybe this isn't fair, but the play that encapsulates all of this to me is the Nebraska game when Nathaniel Vakos trots out for a 29-yard field goal attempt. Somehow they get a delay a game, and he misses the 34-yard field goal attempt. And the explanation after was that we had a little something on, which is we were going to run a fake, and we wanted to let the clock run to make sure that it was on or off. But then they snapped the ball, and he just kicked a regular field goal. And it's like, well, what happened there? I just thought that moment sort of encapsulated, whether fair or not, what we've seen.
Well, I mean, the Nebraska game, handing the ball off instead of taking a knee.
Yeah, that it didn't make sense to me at the time. I want to allow some grace to say you should be able to hand the ball off to a guy who has never fumbled, but were you really going to go 80 yards and score? You end up obviously giving the ball back to Nebraska, and they get points out of it. So I'm going with a D. Despite how hard they've worked, they're under 500.
Well, no, I think some of the end of the half things certainly play into this in-game coaching. Firing your offensive coordinator and that type of stuff, to me, that's off field. But in-game coaching, decisions made in-game, timeouts, whether you go for it, like that type of stuff. Like to me, that is a lot of in-game coaching stuff. Adjustments. How do you adjust to certain things that are happening? I go back to the Iowa game and getting absolutely gashed in the run game. And I asked Mike Tressel about it. Do you have to, you are trying to match them personnel wise, but you have 2 defensive linemen on the field and they're not running the ball, or they're not passing the ball. They throw the ball 20 times the last 2 years combined. I think it might be 23, but they're not passing the ball. don't you at some point have to like adjust? And he goes, yeah, we went heavy nickel, but it wasn't very often. And here's the thing about the Iowa game. They gave up 10 yards, like almost 10 yards of carry when it was 2 defensive linemen. They gave up over 5 when it was 3. So it's not like they were stopping them anyways, but that lack of adjustment stands out to me. I think about the Alabama game and some of the end of half stuff there that they could have gotten out of there with what would have been like 14-3 or 14-6 or something like that. It ended up being 21-3. Like they had, or 28-3. They had certain opportunities to make games of these things. And they just didn't. And I would also say in-game coaching also has a lot to do with, did you get your guys up to play too? And when you're coming off, and I know it was tough, but when you're coming off losses to Oregon and Penn State the way that you did, and then to get just absolutely hammered on the road in back-to-back games, that is a little bit of an indictment on the ability to get up and get going for games. And I think that's to me, that's in-game coaching as well. We could talk about the inability to move the ball on offense and continuing to roll with a certain quarterback, but that, I don't know if that's, I think that might be, I think it might be off-field stuff, just making those decisions, because you're not going to make that decision, I think, in a game. You've made that decision before you go into a game. So all that said, I think that there have been certainly positives. Like you go back to the Illinois game and some of the stuff that they were able to do 2 years ago, right? And the way that they played against Oregon defensively, how they kept that offense in check for almost the entire game. Actually, they did for the entire game. There have been a ton of good moments. They just haven't resulted in like the finality of like you getting anything from it. Like there was a ton of good from the Penn State game. There was a ton of good from the Oregon game that you could look at and build on, and then you just go the next week and just piss it all away. So in losses to quote unquote rivals, there was one rival there. Obviously, Iowa's the rival. The other was just a trophy game. But those are all things that I would encapsulate in-game coaching. So I'm giving him a C-. I'll give him a C-. I was not a great student, and so I got a lot of bad grades. So I'm going to be a little bit more fair grader here, or I should say a little bit more optimistic grader than perhaps Jesse was, because he was obviously a A+ student.
Not accurate.
No. All right. What grade would you give them for on-field coaching? And this is for this, what I'm talking about is practice-wise and improvement, and how exactly they get better. Have they shown improvement and getting and developing team and developing guys and developing the program?
I guess I'll go with a C-.
Okay.
Because if you're framing it that way, what is the thing that Luke has said consistently about if you're not, and he said this in season 1, if you're not playing your best football by, I think he put it like game 8 or something, or you should be playing your best football in game 8, comparing it to game 1.
And it was game 8. It was game 8 because game 8 was Ohio State.
Yeah. Now, they weren't terrible in that game. Lost 24-10, gave a decent showing. But
they honestly, they've done some of their best work against some of the best teams they played.
Yep. They
right? Outside of Alabama.
But if the premise of this category is development over time where you can see consistent improvement, I don't think players are out there getting worse, but the mark of a good program is what happens on the field. Well, what did they do? They closed the season with 5 straight losses for the first time since Barry Alvarez was early in his tenure. There are a lot of glaring weaknesses. Some guys improved, but I just feel like not enough of them did. And it's harder than ever. I don't want to blame it on the transfer portal, but like, it's just a reality, harder than ever to get buy-in and development with dudes who are here 1 year and then leave. And we saw it this offseason. They're going to have 40 plus new players on the roster next season. I don't want to get off completely on a totally different tangent, but I just think when you're talking about coaching and development, that's part of the challenge here too. But again, I go back to, you are what your record says you are. And if you're under 500, it is hard for me to say that these guys got markedly better, where we were seeing them play their best football at the end of the year, even though, yes, There were good moments against really good teams. They still didn't win, and then followed that up with disastrous performances.
Yeah, I think the one thing that stands out about on-field coaching, and I don't know how much. At some point, it's just on the guys, but the continuous mistakes by the quarterback that was here, there was no there wasn't improvement there, and there's no reason to, there's no reason for me to continue to hammer that point home. But he saw the guy and still threw it. So that's going to be one of those things where it wasn't good enough from ultimately it comes to the coaching, I guess. But that has to be something that you improve and you improve and you improve and improve. And you didn't see the improvement there from the quarterback spot with Braden. Was he better? Do you think he was better this past year than he was the year before?
Yeah, I do. But he had more opportunities and more games. For as much as we talk about the things he didn't do well, he still had 13 touchdowns on 10 interceptions. And it was a lot. I mean, he had 3.5 games the year before. That was his first college playing experience ever. So this is tough too, in part because every unit is different. Like, I think AJ Blazik deserves a lot of credit for what he did with that offensive line. And for as much as things didn't go right, especially on offense, I think the O-line did a pretty solid job. Maybe not to the degree that we've seen this O-line perform with its best O-lines, but they, I think, did a very solid job. And so AJ Blazik with his unit deserves high marks, but there's just so much else around it. Obviously, there's Phil Longo, who lost his job and was not only coordinating the offense, but working with the quarterbacks. I don't think the running backs necessarily did enough. It certainly tapered off at the end, but some is good. Just too much wasn't.
Name the players that are better today. Again, drastically better, just because that's easier than just because I think a lot of them are probably better now than they were when they showed up. There's no doubt about that. But guys that have made drastic jumps, Atticus Bertram's, right? The guys that are still here, and there are a lot of guys that are not here that did make that I thought certainly made jumps. Vinny Anthony has made significant jump from the time that he got here. I would say, Joe Brunner is a guy that has made a significant leap since he got here. Christian Allegro is a guy that certainly has made a jump. Ricardo Hallman, I know that he didn't have this past season what it was, but the dude was a third-team All-American last year, which was not something that he was in 2022 when Michigan State did what they did. So Preston Zachman, I can go on down the line and be like, there's guys that have been here for multiple years that clearly are better than they were before.
Yes, absolutely. There's also 85 scholarship players, and you better have some of those guys that have improved. So that's part of the challenge in assessing this, because there's so many different pieces and components, and there are going to be guys that are better, but on the whole, it just hasn't been enough, which I feel like is just going to be a recurring theme throughout all of these categories. I'll try to come up with something different.
Yeah, no, I'm for on-field coaching, I'm going to go with a C. There have been others. I went positive there with all the guys that have improved. I did not talk about the guys that have not improved, or they stayed the same, or for a number of reasons, right? When Jack Nelson came, when Jack Nelson got here, he started 4 years, a couple different positions, but what we thought of him in going into 2023 was one thing, and he was not that guy. I thought he had a much better 2024, but I don't know that he necessarily took that huge leap. And I think some of that is for having different offensive line coaches every single year, but also scheme wise, maybe this wasn't it for him. And I think maybe that's the case for a number of guys that didn't get significantly better, is because the scheme that they were in perhaps was not the one that they should have been playing in, because, well, they weren't here for that. Who else? I don't need to go down there. There are a number of guys like that I think, and either they stayed and just played, or they left and went elsewhere, and that's what happens. Off-field coaching, I'm going this is unfair, but this is kind of be retention, essentially. How do you keeping guys and keeping the players that you want, I guess is all, like how you would grade this off-field coaching, keeping the guys that you want and getting them to come back. Cause that's, I think coaches play a part of that. That's not their only, certainly they're not the only ones here, but overall we can throw NIL in here as well. Off-field coaching.
What about keeping coaches?
Keeping coaches, we can throw that in here as well.
Because
they have not done that. But this isn't a situation like where guys are not leaving for better jobs, right? Has anybody left for a worse job?
Well, not necessarily, but I'm just going to go.
Who?
Well, I think if got to mention the fact that Luke Fickell has fired 2 of his assistants. I mean,
okay. But you said guys leaving as I thought, okay, my bad. Well, that's my bad.
It's all of it. If the word retention is here, you've not been able to retain very many guys. Yeah, obviously. Greg Scribes going to a place like Michigan, short-lived, but still, This is Michigan. Colin Hitchler going to Alabama, short-lived. Still, that's Alabama. Alex Grinch was here 1 year as a stopgap in a position coach role where you can become a defensive coordinator. Yeah, obviously, those are considered step-ups, but still, you're Wisconsin, and if we're judging this from the coaching standpoint, there's been not a lot of retention. And maybe this isn't fair, but Gino Gadugli was here like a month and obviously left. Now, yeah, you're going to Notre Dame, and obviously that worked out because they're playing for a national championship. I'm just saying there have been, yes, Mike Brown too. There's a lot of guys that are here 1 year and gone the next. But I think that also makes it part of the challenge here when you're talking about retention of players, because how can you form relationships with guys when you've got 3 position coaches in as many years and sometimes 4 position coaches in as many years? So that's one aspect. In terms of retention of players, it hasn't been great, but where can you look across the college football landscape and say that it's been fantastic? It's tough. It really is. So the transfer portal recruiting is for a different category, but in terms of losing guys, they've lost 23 scholarship players, quite likely 24 whenever the Xavier Lucas situation resolves itself this offseason. So that's hard.
But the retention aspect is of it. How many of those guys did you want to keep?
Yeah, also fair. Look, a handful of them. Certainly Lucas, Will Pauling, I would think you want. James Thompson Jr., I don't know if they necessarily would have wanted Kurt Neal, but he started all 12 games. There's a bunch of other players that were intriguing. Amari Snowden. I mean, I don't know. Jonas Duclona, Jace Arnold. Maybe they lost their spot in the pecking order. I think Jace Arnold ended up at Sam Houston State, so probably. Yeah, Braden Moore. There's a lot of guys potentially. Jamel Howard. I don't know. Like people that maybe I thought was intriguing, but they weren't seeing enough development out of them. I just think it's harder than ever. I don't know if I've given a grade yet. I'll go C-. It hasn't been great. On the NIL front, I think it's just, man, it's real hard, real hard right now. And let's just be honest about what this is like. There's tampering everywhere. Players getting opportunities and offers at other schools for way more money. I do think things are going to perhaps even out now that we've got a revenue sharing model. Perhaps that's a discussion for another show, but there's more money available and allotted to players in the second half of 2025 that I think at least makes it more likely that guys would be willing to stick around.
See, but here's the thing. That money's fine. It's just, that's the minimum, right? Like that's the minimum that most schools are going to be working with. Ohio State's not going to be only giving their guys $20 million. They're giving their guys $23 million right now. So they're going to have that $20 million or whatever that because obviously it's going to be split between programs there. But obviously the football and the basketball programs are going to get the majority of it. But it's kind of like the above cap spending. Like you have, this is the cap, and then you have all this other money from various sources outside of the school that are going to be able to throw at it. So while we can talk about it may be evening the playing field. I don't think it's going to even the playing field at all. I think it's just going to up the amount of money that some of these teams are going to be able to give people. So either way, that's fine. You mentioned the 2 coaches that he fired. The Jack McNell Jr. hire was up there with Mike Markuson. Do you remember that?
I sure do.
You were here.
2 games, 3 games.
Yeah. in 2012.
Mhm.
Right? It was 2012. It was just a bad hire. And I think if he could have, he would have done the exact same thing that Bielema did. But I don't know that he had somebody waiting in the wings like a Bart Miller to take over. So I mean, I guess Bart Miller was not very experienced at that point, but he did a good enough job. But yeah, the Phil Longo thing just puts this is just in a really, really bad spot. And I think there's a lot of people that will sit here and say that, oh, I knew it wasn't going to work from the jump. It was never going to happen. It just was going to be horrible. I don't think anybody thought it was going to be like that. You know what I mean? Like, I don't think anybody, maybe it's not going to work, but to score the fewest points over a 2-year period since 1990 and 91, like, I don't think anybody envisioned that. So that ended up being just a really, really poor hire. And so off field, I'm gonna give it a D+. I didn't, just I don't think anybody thought it was gonna be that bad. All right, this one should be at least a little bit positive. High school recruiting. What would you give the Fickell program, the Fickell era, a grade for high school recruiting?
Well, they've had back-to-back top 25 classes. I want to go B+ may feel like not high enough because of what they've done. But I think the challenge here is it's one thing to get them, and they deserve a lot of credit for doing that. They had 11 24/7 Sports Composite 4-star prospects in the 2024 class. It's another thing to develop them and make sure that they're contributors here. You don't want to include that here? You just want to say, well,
I don't because that, to me, that's on-field coaching. That's improvement.
Okay. Well,
how did they get better?
Okay, well, you had 15 players in the 2023 class, and there's 4 left. So I realized that was a transitional class. But what is that? Is that not high school recruiting? I mean, you have now. Okay, well, then I give them an A.
You know what? No, you're right.
Because
evaluation is important. Evaluation is important. But I also that's also it's a tough one. The thing is, a lot of those guys were guys that they knew. Right.
It's true. 100%. But some of them were, including a couple 4-star guys. And
no, I'm saying they were. There were guys, like a lot of them, like quite a few of them, they knew.
Yeah. So it's hard for me to separate the two. If you just want to base it on, are you getting really good players and getting people excited? Well, you get as high a marks as you can possibly get. Because again, they did not have 11 4-star prospects before, but then you look and you see, well, 4 of those guys exceeded the 4-game redshirt rule. And not that you're necessarily expecting all of them to play right away. They certainly have some real gems, Darian Dupree, Kevin Haywood, several other players, but you're also going to be losing people. You already lost Xavier Lucas. You can place the blame wherever you want on that, but it's hard for me to say it's an absolute AA+ unless we see what these guys do. But I don't know how you could ask for more from strictly a recruiting standpoint and where they've been able to get these guys. It's a national brand. They've been able to recruit all over the country. Maybe that's good. Maybe that's not, depending on your retention. There are multiple tentacles to this, but it's as high a marks as I'm going to give for any category here, because I think if it comes down to who are you bringing in, they've done a great job.
So I think high school recruiting and transfer portal recruiting are just a little bit different, because transfer portal, you have a lot more stuff to work with to evaluate a kid because he's played college football. And you kind of, so I feel like I can be a little bit more harsh on the transfer portal recruiting because they knew, and it's fast. I'm not saying that they knew the guys like personally and were able to build relationships, even though some of them they knew through high school recruiting, but you're evaluating what they did in college and whether it can happen at your school. High school recruiting, I think, is much more of a crapshoot. So I feel like I don't want to include too much of what has happened because it's also so early for so many of these guys. And the transfer portal also plays a role here, because if they didn't have the transfer portal, a lot more of those young guys would have been playing. Like, they didn't, instead of filling holes with true freshmen, they were filling holes with transfer portal guys. And so I think some of that's just the nature of the beast at this point. So I'm going to give them an A- with high school recruiting. I think they've done a really good job. I think the only spot that you would sit there and say, and again, it's very early, is quarterback still. And that's always been the case at Wisconsin. I think Carter Smith's a really good ad. He's the best quarterback that they've, numbers wise recruited since Graham Mertz. And, he's up there in terms of the best that they've ever gotten. So that is going to be one that we'll see develop. But I'm going to give him an A- at this point. Transfer portal recruiting. Again, now this I'm willing to take into account how they performed, more so than I would be high school.
The challenge here is the haul that they've had this offseason may end up being their best, but I can't know that until I actually see them. And to me, that's a part of the judgment here.
Sure.
I'm willing to go up a level here because of who I think they've gotten this cycle. I'll say C plus. I think they've done a really good job, I feel like, this offseason in trying to upgrade at a lot of the positions that they felt was necessary. They did that the last 2 off seasons too, and it's just hard to, again, separate those two things. When you talk about the level of excitement that they brought in the first off season, obviously off the charts. We hadn't seen anything like that. But what ended up happening with the people that they got? There were a handful of home runs, certainly Will Pauling. Bryson Green did not play to the level that a lot of people thought was possible. Neither did CJ Williams. And some of that clearly had to do with the quarterback play. Tanner Mordecai, as tough as he was, didn't put up huge numbers statistically. Tyler Van Dyke got hurt. Nick Evers transferred out, never really got his shot. Braden Locke, we've talked about many times. You can go down the list. I just don't know that there's been enough true home run difference makers through the portal for me to elevate this into a B grade. But I do feel like there are some pieces in this particular class that you just look on paper and think something is possible for a higher level. So that's why I'm going to go, C plus.
Yeah. So I feel like some of the transfer guys that have come in and made impacts, Tui Walker, and I know he's not, like, Wisconsin's standard for running back is significantly higher than most other schools. I think a lot of schools would probably take what they got from Tui this year. And so I think that has to be at least factored in a little bit. The Nizier Forkring is another guy that I would sit there and say, yep, that was a really good add by this staff. But I think you're right. There have been, and then the offensive line with Joe Huber, who I think is going to get an opportunity in the NFL. I certainly think, Jake Renfro's got another year here, and there's guys further down that could potentially make an impact. But yeah, I mean, Elijah Hill's another guy. Like there are certainly examples of where they hit, but the hits maybe have not been as big as maybe we expected, and maybe that's on us. Like, could it be on us?
Maybe it's a learning experience, much like year one was, where there was all this excitement and it didn't pan out. If you exclude this class, the first 2, they brought in 30 transfer portal guys, if I'm not mistaken, 15 each season. And how many of those, like what percentage of those, and so what percentage of those would you say are home runs? But maybe we use that as a baseline for moving forward. If you say, 30% of these guys have been great, 20% of them were playing and 50% were disappointments, maybe 10 years from now, we'll be able to say that's sort of the baseline level for expectations. And I'm just formulating those numbers off the top of my head. So it's a little bit of a learning experience right now. Yeah, maybe some of it is on us. On the other hand, some of it's on the evaluation and the players. And I mean, Leon Lowry, for example, go on down the list. Darian Varner, guys who had really good careers or put up good numbers previously and then came here and didn't do a ton from a statistical standpoint and then were out after a year. I just feel like we're going to see more and more of that.
And there's also the idea of guys transferring in and having multiple years.
Mm-hmm.
So it's maybe not expecting them to contribute year 1 or year 2, but maybe year 3, a guy like Quincy Burrows could potentially be that guy this year. They knew they had multiple years with Tyro Henry. They knew they had multiple years with several guys. Like another guy like Joseph Griffin. He could come in this year and be a significant piece of this. And maybe we look at that whole thing differently. I don't know, but it has not been. I'm sorry, what'd you give it? You gave it a C plus, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'll give it a B minus. The thing about the transfer portal is, unlike, as I said, with high school recruiting, you kind of know who these guys are before they get here, and it's so. I think the evaluation aspect of it is certainly important. The on-field improvement is important for the younger guys that you have multiple years with. And I think that still remains to be decided on some of those. All right. Fan relations. And I know this one you were asking about, like what I'm talking about. How have they handled the fan base? How have they engaged the fan base and that type of thing?
This might be the hardest one of these questions for me to answer or to grade. I think fan relations, well, fan relations are good when the team wins. And I realize maybe that's not totally fair because it's like you used to have the Mendota Gridiron Club and you had certain situations, the Wisconsin, this isn't fan, it's coaching, but like the coaches clinic and all that stuff.
Which they still have.
Yeah. So I don't know if it's been great because I don't know how often they're getting out there and trying to do fan specific things, but I also, what matters is whether you win the games, and that sort of settles the fan relations to some degree, I feel like. And if you don't win, then these things are more magnified. Maybe I'm wrong.
No, that's right. That's what I was just about to say. People don't care about certain things if you win.
Yes.
If you win, it doesn't matter. If you don't win, and some of this stuff that you used to do that you don't do now because you don't think there was maybe the foresight to continue to do it. And it kind of feels like a little bit of a spit in the face of those fans. When you lose, it gets very, very loud, very, very quickly. Because the goodwill maybe isn't there that was there before. And again, I think most fans only care about winning. That's all that matters. It doesn't, like, I don't care if there's a Mendota Gridiron Club. I don't care if there's this and that. If you win, I'm happy. And if you lose, I'm not happy. But I think there's others that have spent so much time and so much effort and so much bought into this program and bought into Wisconsin football and bought into the university that they feel maybe a little bit slighted and jaded when you do these other things. And it grows even more then you don't win. Because you did certain things a certain way for so long, and sometimes change is hard. No one likes change. I should say very few people enjoy change. And when that change does not go well, it certainly stands out even more. So I don't know that that's a Luke Fickell thing. Like, I don't know that it's a Fickell program thing. I think it may be a Wisconsin overall thing. I think I would certainly throw Chris McIntosh into that mix with some of the stuff, like just things that didn't need to be things. The bricks.
Well, so like that's more of an athletic.
Just didn't need to be. But it's a football thing too. But it's not it's a Fickell era, but it's not a Fickell thing, I guess, is maybe a better way to say it. But I'm just saying, like, fan relations in general, there's just things that didn't need to happen. And I think that there's like some of the concession stuff, like if you want to throw that out there, and the Alabama game where people were out there for like 2 hours, or not 2 hours, but like would try and go get a soda or a water because it was hot as hell. And they spent like 45 minutes in the concourse trying to get that. Like that, again, not necessarily a Fickell thing, but it is a football thing that gets tied to football. And I think people view it as football.
I'm going to go with a C just because I feel like that's playing it down the line of straight average. And I just feel, for lack of a better way to put it, I feel less equipped to be able to answer this question than all the other categories, because it isn't just a Fickell thing. And if you expand it into the athletic department, there's probably a lot more issues. I look at it from, I don't know, is the staff or is Luke doing enough for fans or to maintain their happiness? And again, it goes back to, are you winning?
Yeah, look, I think they still have a ton of opportunities to meet with Luke Fickell, and there are the events that they do for alumni and all the various varsity collective stuff that happens, that, and he's got the radio show that they do, like where fans can come out and see it. Like there's a lot of, yes, there's a lot of that stuff. And I think they deserve credit for that, for sure. But I think some of the other stuff gets tied to it, which is fair or unfair. I think some of that gets tied to it. So I'll go C-. All right. Media relations, obviously the most important part of this, because it starts with a me and has an I in it.
So let me ask you, what's your criteria on this, or how do you look at this? Obviously, I could get super in the weeds on this, but is it strictly how you think Luke or his staff handles the media, or the perception of how they are in the media, or the nitty gritty of what it's like to cover the team and the access and those types of things?
I think it's that last part. I think that's obviously because, yes, I think it's that last part. Because Yes, the last part.
Well,
Look, just before you jump into this, to give you an idea of what it was like before with Paul Christ, most spring practices were open, not all of them. Most we would get what 8, 9, 10 during fall camp. I'm talking about access here. That has significantly increased under Luke Fickell. We get to see every spring practice. We get to see almost every practice down in Platteville, and a bunch more when we come back up here. So like that type of access has increased significantly. And the ability to talk to people, especially that first year where the excitement was really heavy, people were more than happy to talk and enjoyed talking. And so that was really good. So I think there's, but I'll let you dive into it because you obviously have, you write about it every day. I think, and the writing aspect, as opposed to me talking about it, takes so much more, and you need so much more.
It's changed over the years significantly. My first season on the beat was 2011, and college football has changed too. So I guess if we're going to get in the weeds, then let's do this. Yeah, the access in terms of practice, it's great. To be able to see every spring practice is truly meaningful for us as reporters to then convey to you watching, listening, what's happening and what we're seeing. I think if I recall the very last fall camp that Paul was here, 2022, he cut it down significantly. There were only like 4 practices. There were only 4 practices that were open. So that's much better. And certainly, look, we appreciate the access to be able to see that. I guess the thing that's changed over time is the access to people within the program. Now, that doesn't mean you can't get access to people. I still ask and am still granted access, and obviously I'm thankful for that. When I first got here, or maybe it was a year or two, the access was extraordinary in a way that I don't think any program could even be on that level. And maybe you didn't need all this. You probably didn't. But way back when,
I want it all. I want it all.
You got people Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. On Monday, you got the head coach. I think they made 4 of the captains available. On Tuesday, you got to pick like 3 offensive players. On Wednesday, you got 3 defensive players. On Thursday, they made the head coach available again. That has obviously changed. Luke does his one Monday press conference. They don't do a Thursday one. And I'm not really sure how much value there was in that anyway, because by that point, you were probably done with covering the program for that week. And it was just injury update type things. I think the most notable thing, though, is probably the ability to talk to assistant coaches during the season and maybe players as well. Let's just be honest about it. In year 1, we got Phil Longo once during the season. And I think some of this was Luke wanted to perhaps not put those guys in positions to talk to us. He wanted to control more of the things, but that was totally different because even the year before, you got the offensive coordinator and defensive coordinator every week during game week, which is tremendously valuable. And then we got Longo again during bowl prep. I think it was the same with Tressel. Now they changed that this past year. We were able to get one of them every other week. So we got him like 3 or 4 times during the season. A long, long time ago, you could request assistant coaches on the days that you had offensive players or defensive players. So if I wanted 3 defensive guys and I also wanted to talk to the defensive line coach, you could do that. You can't do that anymore. Now, that doesn't mean that if I'm writing a special story on something that is worth talking to someone for 15 minutes, that doesn't mean I can't get them. Things are just different now. So I realize this is a very long-winded answer. I would still say I think it's better than it is at a lot of other programs. And I know that because at The Athletic, we still have a lot of other beat writers in other conferences where it's much more challenging to get people you want. So I'm going to say overall, it is a B. I think it's better than most places. It's evolved in the decade plus that I've been here. And there are certain things that I'd want more of, but I'm always going to want more things when it comes to access to people, because that's my bread and butter. That's how I get paid and have a job.
So I cannot allow any talk about, and I never have been able to do this. I have never been able to allow any talk about assistant coaches and not being able to talk to them anymore without bringing up why we don't, why that access ended in 2016. And I want to say it's your fault, but I'm not going to. But can you tell the story of of what happened?
Well, I think there were multiple things that occurred.
But I'll tell the story of the other person, but I'll let you go first.
Yeah. Well, I did an all access story on Jim Leonard back in 2016 and got to sit into the meeting rooms. And it was the week of the Ohio State game. And it was going to run the same week. And it would have been a story that pleased everybody. Everybody would have been happy with it, if not for a handful of paragraphs that talked about Jim discussing the scouting report on Ohio State. And I should have had conversations with Wisconsin, and they should have had conversations with me. And it still was a really good story. It's just
Fantastic.
One of those stories that, when you cover a team, the challenge is striking a balance of, a lot of things and some things you shouldn't write. And in retrospect, there were a couple paragraphs that probably should not have been in the story, even though, again, I thought it was a good story. And, I think Jim would have talked the next day, and they didn't make him available, but that's only, I suppose, part of why the access has diminished and sort of never gone back to being able to get assistants every week. I also think maybe they felt like assistants in general, it was like, it ended up being like, hey, let me get so-and-so as an assistant for 10 or 15 minutes. And it was kind of like, well, do you really need them? Or are you just throwing it out there because you've got a fourth person? And I think that was part of it too.
So those paragraphs included mentioning Noah Brown not having any speed, I believe was part of that. Is that accurate?
It was something to that effect about them feeling like that he wasn't going to beat them over the top, and he ended up getting the touchdown in overtime that won the game. And I know Ohio State's wide receivers coach at the time made a big deal out of that story.
I honestly don't think that was the reason for the assistant. Like, it is what it is. The other story that week, because it happened the same week, was Antonio Williams, yeah, I'll throw him under the bus. Evan Flood was talking with the running backs coach at the time, which was
John
Settle, and John Settle just went off on Antonio Williams. Like, this isn't Evan's fault. Like, John Settle just went off on it, and Evan put it all in, and that to me was probably more so. And we've talked to the guys that who are no longer obviously the people that make those decisions, because they're not they've moved into different jobs, but they said that they denied that. But I think it certainly played a pretty significant role in the lack of assistance, because we never saw assistance after that for like in season where you got a chance to do that. That was the end of it. So
here's what I would say also. If you cover a team for a long, long time and you write thousands of stories, there are going to be times when you piss people off and times when you make a mistake, and nobody's perfect. And hopefully what you've done over time will stand out enough to help you overcome those things. But it was a learning experience, I think, for everybody involved. And it was still a good story, though.
Yeah, no, it was. But I feel like, I mean, I think there are other stories to tell, but just not today, and perhaps not while we have these jobs. So, but but maybe someday down the line. But so you went with B. I'll go with.
I don't even know if I gave. Oh yeah, I did. Okay, B.
Yeah. I'll go with B plus, because they have more often than not, and it's a little bit different for you than it is for me. Like, trying to get people in to do interviews like this is more difficult, because it's just like, well, I can record at this time, and you're just like, I'll talk to you whenever you possibly have an opportunity. And so it's a little bit more difficult, but I have appreciated the continued access, even though maybe back when I first started and was writing every day, and like, that's not my role anymore. You know what I mean? Like, I don't have that same role where I'm trying to write stories every day. And so I don't know that I need as the same access as you do. And it's a little bit different, but they've still allowed me to do a lot of the same stuff. And so I appreciate that. All right. Overall grade for Luke Fickell and company here.
C.
Okay.
I'll keep it short. You're under 500. You're average.
D, C minus, C minus, B plus, C plus, C, B. I think C kind of makes sense. If that's yeah. I think mine's probably then. I guess mine would probably be a C plus. I guess mine would be a C plus.
Have our roles reversed here? Are we in a bizarro world?
Where
This
you're
might be
more
that
negative
Seinfeld episode?
Where you're more negative than me?
Maybe, at least for a show.
For show. Look, do you think if we were to do this next year, the grades would be better?
This is
unfair.
This is
so
a
hard.
really difficult question to answer because I don't think that they're going to have a great season given who they have to play. I just don't. I'll gladly eat crow here a year from now because it would mean we had something exciting to cover. And I root for the storyline.
That's all that matters.
And if you don't win games, it's hard for me to give higher grades for these things. Again, I don't want to make it seem like there's a lack of effort involved. They are working tirelessly to make this program what everybody wants it to be. It's just more challenging than ever for so many different reasons. And the schedule doesn't help.
It doesn't help at all. But still fun to watch. All right. Jesse, we went extremely long today, but you'll have that. Appreciate your time. We'll catch up later this week.
Thanks, Zach.
We will have. So they have filled out their coaching staff, right? In the next weeks, we'll be getting an opportunity to chat with some of the assistant coaches, the new assistant coaches, including offensive coordinator Jeff Grimes. The media, I should say, is going to get an opportunity to do that. So we'll have a little bit more idea of exactly what they're going to be looking at, and perhaps we'll be able to divulge a little bit of that coming up very, very soon. So, Jesse, thank you.
Thanks, Zach.
All right, there it is. Jesse Temple from The Athletic. You've been listening to The Camp.